Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we journey into the mystical realm of Japanese mythology, where kami dwell in every grain of rice and gust of wind, where spirits dance between the worlds of the living and the dead, and where the sacred and mundane interweave like threads in an endless tapestry. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from. Find your peace beneath whatever sky watches over you tonight, and let us begin. In the beginning, there was only the void, formless and without substance, stretching infinite and empty across dimensions that had no names. But within this nothingness stirred the first consciousness, the primordial awareness that would birth the kami, the divine spirits that would inhabit all things, from the mightiest mountain to the smallest pebble, from the raging typhoon to the gentle morning breeze. The first kami to achieve individual existence were three beings of pure spirit. Amenemene, the divine lord of the center of heaven, who established the cosmic axis around which all creation would revolve. To Kamimasubi, the high generative force, who brought the power of growth and expansion into being. And Kamimasubi, the divine generative force, who complemented this power with the ability to nurture and sustain what had been created. These three were called the Zoka Sanshin, the three creator kami, and they were formless, invisible, existing as pure intention and will rather than as beings that could be perceived or understood by lesser minds. They spoke no words, for words had not yet been invented, but their combined will began the great work of creation, establishing the principles that would govern the cosmic order for all time to come. From their unified desire for form and substance came the first physical manifestations of divine power. The void began to differentiate itself, separating into heaven and earth, though these were not yet the solid realms they would become. Heaven was called Takamanohara, the high plane of heaven, while earth remained in a state of flux, like oil floating on water, neither fully liquid nor fully solid. Into this emerging cosmos came 7 generations of kami, each pair adding new elements to creation, new principles of order and beauty. The final generation brought forth the 2 beings who would complete the work of creation: Izanagi, the male who invites, and Izanami, the female who invites. These 2 stood on the rainbow bridge that connected heaven and earth, looking down at the chaotic waters below, and took upon themselves the task of bringing form and purpose to the world. The older kami gave them the heavenly jeweled spear, Amenenohoko, a weapon that was also a tool of creation, whose power could stir the primal waters and bring forth solid land. Standing together on the bridge, Izanagi thrust the spear down into the chaos below and stirred the waters in great circles. When he lifted the spear, drops of brine fell from its tip and hardened into the first island, Onagoro, the self-forming island. Descending to this island, the divine couple built the first dwelling, a palace with a pillar at its center that connected earth to heaven. Around this pillar they walked in opposite directions, Izanagi to the left, Izanami to the right, and when they met, they spoke the first words of love and recognition. But their first attempt at union was flawed, for Izanami spoke first, and in the cosmic order that was still forming, this reversal of proper roles brought forth imperfect children. The Hiriko, the leech child, who was born without bones and had to be set adrift on the waters to find his own destiny. Learning from this mistake, they performed the ritual again with proper observance of cosmic law. This time Izanagi spoke first, and their union brought forth perfect children, the islands of Japan itself, each one emerging from their divine love as a sacred space where kami could dwell and humans could live in harmony with the natural world. Awaji Island came first, then Shikoku, then Kyushu, then the great island of Honshu, and finally the northern reaches that would one day be called Hokkaido. Each island had its own personality, its own kami, its own gifts to offer the humans who would eventually inhabit them. But all were connected by the divine love that had created them, part of a sacred archipelago that would serve as the earthly dwelling place of the gods. With the physical framework of Japan established, Izanagi and Izanami began to create the kami who would govern the various aspects of existence. They gave birth to the gods of wind and mountain, sea and river, forest and field. Each natural feature received its own divine spirit, its own consciousness that would shape its behavior and respond to the reverence or neglect of humans. The sea kami were vast and powerful, capable of bringing both prosperity through fishing and trade, and destruction through storms and tsunamis. The mountain kami were ancient and wise, slower to anger but terrible in their wrath when the peaks were disrespected or defiled. The river kami were playful and changeable, sometimes helpful to travelers and farmers, sometimes mischievous and dangerous. But the creation was not complete, for the world needed fire to drive away the darkness and cold. When Izanami gave birth to Kagetsuchi, the kami of fire, the flames burned her so severely that she died from her injuries. Her death was the first death, the introduction of mortality into a cosmos that had known only generation and growth. Izanagi's grief was beyond measure. He wept tears that became rivers, and where his tears fell, new kami were born, spirits of sorrow and mourning who would comfort humans in their own times of loss. In his rage, he drew his sword and killed Kagetsuchi, but even this act of vengeance brought forth new creation. From the fire god's blood sprang 8 more kami of mountains and metalworking, while from his dismembered body came the 8 thunder gods who would rule the storms. But grief and rage could not restore Izanami to life. Desperate to reclaim his beloved wife, Izanagi resolved to follow her into Yomi, the shadowy underworld where the dead dwelt in darkness and decay. This journey would test the bonds of love against the fundamental laws of existence, and its outcome would establish the permanent separation between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The path to Yomi led through caverns deep beneath the earth, where no light penetrated and the air itself seemed thick with the presence of death. Izanagi called out for his wife as he descended, and she answered from the depths, warning him not to look upon her, for she had already eaten the food of the underworld and could not return to the land of the living. But love made Izanagi reckless. Despite her warnings, he lit a torch to see her face once more. What he saw horrified him. Izanami's beautiful form had become corrupted by death, her flesh rotting, her body crawling with maggots and inhabited by 8 thunder kami who had made their homes in her decaying corpse. The sight was so terrible that he fled in terror, abandoning his wife to the darkness below. Izanami's rage at this betrayal was terrible. She pursued him through the tunnels of Yomi, no longer the loving wife he remembered, but a fury bent on dragging him down into death with her. Behind her came the Yamatsu Shikome, the hags of Yomi, creatures of pure malice who sought to devour the living god. Izanagi escaped by blocking the entrance to Yomi with a great boulder, but not before Izanami had screamed her curse. She would kill 1,000 living beings each day. Izanagi's response established the cosmic balance that would govern life and death forever after. He would create 1,500 new lives each day, ensuring that life would always triumph over death, that creation would always exceed destruction. But the trauma of his journey to Yomi had polluted Izanagi with the taint of death. To purify himself, he bathed in the river at Tachibana, and from this purification came some of the most important kami in the Japanese pantheon. From his left, I was born Amaterasu, the sun goddess, most radiant and powerful of all the kami. From his right, I came Tsukuyami, the moon god, whose cool light would balance his sister's warm radiance. From his nose came Susanoo, the storm god, wild and tempestuous, whose power could bring both devastation and renewal. These three were called the Mahashara no Yuzunomiko, the three noble children, and to them Izanagi entrusted the governance of the cosmos. To Amaterasu he gave dominion over Takamanohara, the high plane of heaven, and the responsibility of bringing light and life to all creation. To Tsukuyami he gave the realm of night, the time of rest and dreams when the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. To Susanoo he gave the sea and storms, the wild forces that could not be tamed but had to be respected and propitiated. But Susanoo was not content with his inheritance. He wept and raged, causing such storms that mountains crumbled and rivers ran backward. When Izanagi demanded to know why he was so unhappy, Susanoo declared that he wished to visit his mother in Yomi, to join Izanami in the land of the dead rather than rule over the chaotic forces he had been given. Izanagi, horrified by this desire for death and reunion with corruption, banished Susanoo from his presence. But before departing for Yomi, the storm god decided to visit his sister Amaterasu in Takamanohara, ostensibly to bid her farewell but actually nursing darker intentions born of jealousy and resentment. Amaterasu, sensing the destructive power in her brother's approach, armed herself for war, donning armor and taking up her bow. The very sky shook with the force of their confrontation, but Susanoo protested that he came in peace, that he merely wished to say goodbye before departing for the underworld. To prove his peaceful intentions, he proposed a contest of creation. They would each create new kami, and the nature of these offspring would reveal the truth of their hearts. Amaterasu took Susanoo's sword and broke it into 3 pieces, which she chewed and spat out as 3 graceful goddesses. Susanoo took his sister's necklace of Magatama beads, and from them created 5 male kami of great beauty and power. Susanoo claimed victory, declaring that since the male kami were born from Amaterasu's possessions, they were his children and proved his superior creative power. But his triumph made him reckless, and his celebration took increasingly destructive forms. He destroyed the rice fields that Amaterasu had carefully cultivated, filled in the irrigation channels, and defecated in the sacred hall where the gods performed their rituals. Amaterasu endured these outrages with divine patience, making excuses for her brother's behavior, trying to find innocent explanations for his destructive acts. But Susanoo's final transgression broke even her compassionate heart. As she sat weaving in her sacred hall with her attendant maidens, Susanoo broke a hole in the roof and threw down a heavenly horse that he had flayed alive. One of the weaving maidens was so startled by this horror that she pricked herself with her shuttle and died from the wound. The death of innocence was more than Amaterasu could bear. In her grief and anger, she withdrew into Amnoawado, the heavenly rock cave, and sealed the entrance with a massive boulder. With the sun goddess hidden away, darkness fell across all the worlds. Crops withered in the fields, evil spirits emerged from their hiding places to terrorize humans and animals alike, and chaos began to creep back into the cosmos that had been so carefully ordered. The very fabric of creation began to unravel, for without Amaterasu's light, the fundamental principles that maintained order and beauty could not function. The 8 million kami of heaven gathered in council, desperately seeking a way to coax the sun goddess from her cave. But Amaterasu would not listen to their pleas, would not respond to their arguments or their offers of recompense. She had withdrawn from a world that seemed to reward destruction more than creation, violence more than patience, cruelty more than kindness. It was Amnoyuzum, the kami of dawn and revelry, who conceived the plan that would restore light to the world. She placed a mirror before the cave entrance, hung jeweled necklaces from the surrounding trees, and began to dance with such wild abandon that her clothing fell away and her movements became increasingly provocative. The other kami burst into laughter at her performance, creating such a din of merriment that it echoed across all the heavens. Curious about what could cause such joy in a world she believed had fallen into permanent darkness, Amaterasu cracked open the cave entrance and peered out. When she saw the mirror, she was startled by her own reflection, thinking she beheld another sun goddess. As she emerged further to investigate, Tajikaro, the kami of strength, grasped her hand and pulled her fully from the cave, while others quickly stretched a rope across the entrance to prevent her from returning to hiding. Light returned to the world, but the cosmos had been changed by the experience of darkness. The temporary victory of chaos over order served as a warning that the cosmic balance was fragile, that even the mightiest gods could be driven to despair, that vigilance was required to prevent the forces of destruction from overwhelming the delicate beauty of creation. Susanoo faced judgment for his crimes against his sister and the natural order. The kami stripped him of his divine beard and fingernails, symbols of his power and status, and banished him from heaven to wander the earth as an exile. But even this punishment would become a source of redemption, for Susanoo's journey through the mortal world would teach him compassion and wisdom, transforming him from a destructive force into a protector of humanity. The reconciliation between Amaterasu and Susanoo would not come easily or quickly, but it would come, for the Japanese understanding of existence was fundamentally cyclical. Conflict led to separation, separation led to loneliness, loneliness led to understanding, and understanding led ultimately to reconciliation on a higher level. Even the most bitter divisions could be healed if the parties were willing to grow and change, to see beyond their immediate grievances to the larger patterns that connected all existence. This great myth of the sun goddess's withdrawal and return became one of the foundational stories of Japanese culture, explaining not only the natural phenomena of eclipses and seasonal changes, but also the spiritual truth that light could be restored even after the darkest periods of despair and conflict. It promised that no matter how terrible the circumstances, no matter how complete the victory of darkness seemed, the potential for renewal and redemption remained alive in the world. The mirror that had drawn Amaterasu from her cave became one of the 3 sacred treasures of Japan, along with the sword that Susanoo would later discover and the jeweled necklace that represented the beauty and abundance of creation. These treasures symbolized the 3 aspects of legitimate authority: wisdom to see truly, power to act decisively, and compassion to rule with justice and mercy. But the Age of the Gods was not merely about cosmic dramas played out on the stage of heaven. It was also about the establishment of the relationship between the divine and human realms, the creation of the structures and principles that would allow mortals to live in harmony with the kami while maintaining their own dignity and agency as conscious beings. The kami were not distant rulers who commanded from on high but intimate presences woven into the fabric of daily life. They dwelt in the sacred groves that surrounded village shrines, in the waterfalls where young men purified themselves before important undertakings, in the rice fields where families had worked for generations, in the hearth fires that warmed homes and cooked meals. This intimacy between the divine and mundane created a religious culture unlike any other in the world, one that found the sacred not in transcending the physical world, but in recognizing the spiritual essence that animated all material existence. Every meal was a communion with the kami who had made the food possible. Every bath was a ritual purification. Every act of cleaning and organizing was a participation in the cosmic work of bringing order out of chaos. But the presence of kami in all things also meant that humans bore a constant responsibility to maintain proper relationships with the spiritual forces around them. Neglect of the kami brought misfortune. Crop failures, natural disasters, illness, and social discord. Proper attention and reverence ensured harmony, prosperity, health, and peace. This created a culture of intense mindfulness, where every action was understood to have spiritual as well as practical consequences. The farmer who planted his rice with proper attention to ritual was not being superstitious but acknowledging the reality that his success depended not only on physical factors like soil and weather but also on his relationship with the kami who governed agricultural abundance. The craftsman who began each day by purifying himself and his tools was recognizing that the quality of his work depended not only on his skill but also on his spiritual state, on his harmony with the kami who guided the transformation of raw materials into objects of beauty and utility. The mother who taught her children to bow before the family shrine was not merely preserving tradition, but initiating them into a way of life that recognized the sacred dimension of all existence. Yet this intimate relationship with the divine did not make life easier or simpler. If anything, it made existence more complex, more demanding, more filled with potential for both transcendence and catastrophe. For if kami dwelt in all things, then all things possess the potential for both blessing and curse, for both harmony and conflict. The understanding that emerged from this complexity was essentially ecological, the recognition that all existence was interconnected, that the welfare of any individual part depended on the health of the whole, that harmony could only be maintained through constant attention to balance and reciprocity. This would become one of the defining characteristics of Japanese culture, the foundation for aesthetic principles, social structures, and spiritual practices that would endure for thousands of years. But first, the cosmic order had to be fully established, the relationships between gods and mortals clearly defined, and the principles of proper governance encoded in stories that would teach each generation how to live in harmony with both the natural world and the divine forces that animated it. After his banishment from heaven, Susanoo wandered the earth as an exile, his divine power constrained by his punishment but not entirely extinguished. His journey would transform him from a destructive force into a protector of humanity, but that transformation would require him to confront the consequences of his own nature and learn the difference between strength and wisdom. His wandering brought him to the land of Izumo, where he encountered an elderly couple weeping beside a river. They were Ashinazuchi and Tenazuchi, kami of the mountains, and their grief was for their daughter Kushinadaheim, the last of 8 sisters who had been devoured one by the great serpent Yamata no Orochi. This monster was terror itself given form. 8 heads and 8 tails, eyes like winter cherries, a body so vast that it stretched across 8 valleys and 8 hills, with moss and cypress trees growing from its back. Each year it came to claim one of the sisters, and now only Kushinada remained, beautiful and doomed, waiting for the serpent's return. Susanoo looked upon the maiden's beauty and felt something stir within his heart that was not mere desire but recognition. Here was innocence that deserved protection, beauty that should be preserved, love that could redeem even the most violent of spirits. He offered to slay the serpent in exchange for Kushinada's hand in marriage, and the desperate parents agreed immediately. But Susanoo was no longer the impetuous youth who had destroyed his sister's rice fields in a fit of pique. His exile had taught him patience and cunning. Rather than confronting Yamata no Orochi directly, he devised a trap worthy of his divine intelligence. He transformed Kushinada into a comb and placed her safely in his hair, then instructed her parents to brew 8 vats of the strongest sake and place them behind 8 gates built in their compound. When the great serpent arrived, it found the sake and greedily drank from all 8 vats simultaneously, 1 head to each container. The alcohol was so strong and so abundant that even a monster of Yamata no Orochi's size was overcome by it. As the serpent fell into drunken stupor, Susanoo drew his sword and began the methodical work of dismemberment. The battle was long and bloody, for even unconscious, the serpent's body thrashed with such violence that it carved new valleys and raised new hills. But Susanoo's blade was sharp and his purpose was clear. He severed each head, each tail, cutting the monster into pieces so small that it could never reassemble itself and threaten innocence again. From the 4th tail of the serpent, his sword struck something harder than flesh and bone. Investigating, he discovered another sword, gleaming with its own inner light, sharper and more beautiful than any weapon ever forged. This was Izanagi, the grass-cutting sword, one of the 3 imperial treasures of Japan, though its true nature and power would not be fully understood until much later. Recognizing that this weapon was too precious to keep for himself, Susanoo sent it as a gift to his sister Amaterasu, both as an offering of peace and as acknowledgement of her superior authority. The gesture marked the beginning of his redemption, the first step in his transformation from chaos-bringer to guardian of order. His marriage to Kushinada was blessed by all the kami of earth and heaven, for it represented the union of power and beauty, strength and grace, the wild forces of nature tamed by love and channeled toward protective purposes. Their palace in Izumo became a model for how humans should live, in harmony with the natural world but not dominated by it, conscious of divine presence but not overwhelmed by it. From their union came many children, kami who would govern various aspects of human civilization: agriculture, craftsmanship, music, poetry, and the martial arts. Each child embodied a different way of channeling natural power toward constructive purposes, of finding meaning and beauty in the midst of struggle and change. Susanoo's redemption was complete when he began to teach humans the arts they would need to survive and flourish in a world that contained both beauty and danger, both harmony and conflict. He showed them how to read the signs in nature that warned of storms and earthquakes, how to build structures that could withstand the elements, how to work with the kami rather than trying to command or ignore them. But perhaps most importantly, he taught them about the possibility of redemption itself, that even those who had committed terrible crimes, who had caused immense suffering, who had violated the most sacred trusts, could find a path back to honor and usefulness if they were willing to accept responsibility for their actions and dedicate themselves to serving something greater than their own desires. This teaching would become central to Japanese spiritual culture, embodied in practices like seppuku, where warriors who had failed in their duties could restore their honor through ritual suicide, and in the concept of giri, the recognition that individual desires must sometimes be sacrificed for the sake of family, community, or larger spiritual principles. The transformation of Susanoo from destroyer to protector established one of the fundamental patterns of Japanese mythology: the understanding that conflict and harmony were not permanent states but phases in an endless cycle of growth and change. The storm god's rage had been terrible and destructive, but it had also cleared away stagnation and complacency, creating space for new forms of beauty and meaning to emerge. This cyclical understanding of existence would influence every aspect of Japanese culture, from the aesthetic principle of mono no aware, the bittersweet appreciation of the transient nature of all beautiful things, to the political concept of the mandate of heaven, which recognized that even legitimate authority must constantly renew itself through virtuous action and responsiveness to the needs of the people. The reconciliation between Amaterasu and Susanoo was not merely a personal matter between siblings, but a cosmic necessity. For the sun and the storm were both essential to the functioning of the natural world. Their conflict had nearly destroyed creation, but their eventual harmony would ensure that the forces of nature worked together to support life rather than competing to destroy it. Yet, even as the great kami learned to work together, new challenges were emerging that would test the stability of the cosmic order they had established. The world was growing more complex, the relationships between divine and human realms more intricate, and the ancient patterns that had governed existence since creation were beginning to show signs of strain. In the realm of mortals, heroes and villains were emerging whose deeds would rival those of the gods themselves, whose stories would become part of the great tapestry of myth that explained how the world worked and what role humans were meant to play in its ongoing creation. The age of pure divine action was ending, and the age of collaboration between gods and mortals was about to begin. As the kami established their governance over the natural world, Amaterasu turned her attention to the realm of mortals, seeking to ensure that humans would have wise and just rulers who could maintain harmony between the divine and earthly realms. From her sacred weaving hall in Takamanohara, she watched the affairs of Japan with growing concern. For though the islands were beautiful and the kami were protective, humans left to their own devices often fell into conflict and chaos. The solution she conceived was elegant in its simplicity and profound in its implications. She would send her own grandson to rule as the first emperor of Japan, establishing a divine bloodline that would ensure proper governance for all time to come. This grandson was Ninigi, a kami of noble bearing and wise heart, trained from birth in the arts of leadership and the responsibilities of sacred authority. But Ninigi could not simply appear in the mortal world and claim dominion. The cosmic order required that power be transferred according to proper ritual and with the consent of those who would be governed. Amaterasu sent messengers to prepare the way, kami who would convince the local rulers that divine intervention was both necessary and beneficial. The most important of these messengers was Saratahiko, a powerful kami who dwelt at the crossroads between heaven and earth. His nose was 7 hands long, his back 7 fathoms broad. His eyes gleamed like mirrors, and his presence was so imposing that even other kami stepped aside when he approached. Yet despite his fearsome appearance, Saratahiko was fundamentally benevolent, a guardian of travelers and guide for those making difficult transitions. Aim no Yuzum, the dawn goddess whose dance had lured Amaterasu from her cave, was sent to negotiate with this powerful kami. Their meeting was a courtship as much as a diplomatic encounter, for Yuzum's beauty and clever tongue charmed the giant kami into becoming her husband and accepting the role of guide for Ninigi's descent to Earth. When all preparations were complete, Amaterasu summoned her grandson and gave him the 3 sacred treasures that would become the symbols of legitimate rule in Japan. The mirror Yatano Kagami would remind him to see truly, to reflect reality without distortion, to govern according to wisdom rather than whim. The sword Kusanagi would give him the power to protect his people and defeat their enemies. The jeweled necklace Yasakani no Magatama would connect him to the abundance and beauty of creation, ensuring that his rule brought prosperity rather than mere order. With these treasures and a retinue of kami to serve as his advisors and companions, Ninigi descended from heaven to the peak of Mount Takachiho in Kyushu. His arrival marked the beginning of the divine age of Japanese history, when the boundary between gods and mortals was permeable and the emperor was not merely a political leader, but a living kami whose person embodied the connection between heaven and earth. Ninigi's rule established the pattern that would govern Japanese imperial ideology for over 2 millennia. The emperor was divine not through personal achievement but through bloodline, not through conquering divinity but through inheriting it. This divine nature imposed obligations as much as it granted privileges. The emperor was responsible for maintaining harmony between all the various forces and interests within his realm, for ensuring that the cosmic order was reflected in human society. The early emperors were understood to be shamans as much as kings, intermediaries who could communicate with the kami and interpret their will for human understanding. They performed the great seasonal rituals that ensured the continuing fertility of the land, the proper succession of seasons, the harmony between natural and social orders. Their palaces were built as sacred spaces where heaven and earth could meet. Their courts were attended by priests and diviners who helped them understand the spiritual dimensions of political decisions. But the mythology did not present these divine rulers as perfect or all-powerful. They were subject to the same cosmic laws that governed all existence, capable of making mistakes that would have far-reaching consequences, dependent on the wisdom and support of others to fulfill their sacred responsibilities. The stories told of their struggles and failures as well as their triumphs, making them models of how humans should aspire to live rather than distant figures to be worshipped from afar. Ninnagi's marriage to Kanahana Sakuyahime, the cherry blossom princess, embodied many of the themes that would define Japanese attitudes toward love, beauty, and the passage of time. The princess was daughter of Oyamitsumi, kami of the mountains, and her beauty was so breathtaking that flowers bloomed more brightly in her presence, and even the stones seemed to sing with joy. But when Ninnagi asked for her hand in marriage, her father offered him both daughters, Kanahana Sakuyahime and her elder sister Iwanagahime, the rock princess, whose beauty was more subtle, but whose nature was eternal and unchanging. Ninnagi, captivated by the cherry blossom maiden's radiant beauty, accepted her but rejected the rock princess, not understanding the symbolic significance of his choice. Oyamitsumi's response revealed the cosmic implications of this decision. Had Ninnagi married both sisters, his descendants would have possessed both the beauty and joy of the cherry blossom and the eternal endurance of stone. By choosing only the cherry blossom maiden, he ensured that his bloodline would be beautiful and blessed but also mortal, subject to the same cycles of bloom and fade that governed all living things. This myth encoded one of the most profound insights of Japanese spiritual thought, that the beauty of life was inseparable from its transience, that the very fact that beautiful things did not last forever was what made them precious. The cherry blossom became the symbol of this understanding, blooming magnificently for a brief period each spring before falling to earth in a shower of petals that was both heartbreaking and breathtakingly beautiful. The marriage of Ninnagi and Kanahana Sakuyahime was blessed with children who would establish the divine bloodline that would rule Japan through all the ages to come. But it was also shadowed by the knowledge that this bloodline, for all its divine origin, would be subject to the limitations of mortality, that each emperor would face the choice between pursuing lasting beauty through acceptance of transience or seeking permanence through the rejection of life's natural rhythms. As the generations passed and the divine bloodline established itself more firmly in the human world, the stories began to focus more on the interaction between gods and mortals, the ways in which divine power could be channeled through human agency, and the development of the complex ritual and social structures that would allow a divine emperor to rule effectively over a mortal population. The mythology of this period was rich with tales of heroes who embodied particular virtues, of conflicts that tested the strength of the social order, of innovations that advanced human civilization while maintaining harmony with the natural world. These stories served not only as entertainment but as education, teaching each generation how to navigate the complex relationships between individual desire and social responsibility, between human ambition and divine will, between the need for change and the importance of preserving what was valuable from the past. The framework established by the great creation myths continued to govern these later stories, but it was applied with increasing sophistication to address the more complex challenges that arose as Japanese civilization matured and encountered new ideas from the wider world. In the misty borderlands between the Age of Gods and the Age of Heroes, when the kami still walked openly among mortals but humans had begun to assert their own will in shaping their destiny, there arose a figure who embodied the complex relationship between divine power and human responsibility. This was Yamato Takeru, the brave of Yamato, a prince whose deeds would make him legendary, but whose story would also reveal the tragic costs of power wielded without wisdom. Yamato Takeru was born as Usu, younger son of Emperor Keiko, in an age when Japan was not yet unified under a single rule but remained a collection of separate tribes and kingdoms, each with its own traditions, its own kami, its own claims to legitimacy. The prince was gifted with tremendous strength and courage, but also with a violent temper that made him dangerous even to those he loved. The first sign of his troubled nature came when he killed his own elder brother in a dispute over a woman. The murder was committed during a morning purification ritual, when the brother was vulnerable and unsuspecting. Usu broke the victim's limbs and wrapped the body in a straw mat, disposing of it with such casual brutality that even his father, the emperor, was horrified by his son's callousness. Rather than punish the prince directly, Emperor Keiko chose to channel his son's violent nature toward useful ends. He sent Usu to subdue the Kamaso rebels in southern Kyushu, hoping that the challenges of warfare might either kill the troublesome prince or teach him the discipline he so desperately needed. The mission to defeat the Kamaso became the first of Yamato Takeru's great adventures, and it revealed both his martial prowess and his capacity for cunning that bordered on deception. Rather than attacking the rebel stronghold directly, he infiltrated their great feast disguised as a beautiful maiden. His feminine disguise was so convincing that the Kamaso brothers welcomed him into their inner circle, never suspecting that the lovely woman who danced and poured wine was actually their deadliest enemy. At the height of the feast, when the rebels were drunk and off guard, Yamato Takeru revealed his true identity and struck down both brothers with swift sword strokes. As the elder brother lay dying, he gave the prince the name by which he would be known for all time. Yamato Takeru, recognizing in his killer a warrior whose deeds would become legend throughout the land. The success of this mission established Yamato Takeru's reputation as the empire's greatest champion, but it also revealed the dark methods he was willing to employ in service of his father's goals. His victories were undeniably impressive, but they were achieved through deception, violation of hospitality, and the breaking of implicit trusts that governed civilized behavior. Emperor Keiko, rather than celebrating his son's triumph, sent him on an even more dangerous mission: to subdue the Emishur tribes in the remote eastern provinces, a task that would require not just military skill, but the ability to navigate complex political relationships and cultural differences. The emperor's true hope may have been that this mission would claim his son's life, removing a valuable but uncontrollable weapon from the political equation. Before departing for the east, Yamato Takeru visited the grand shrine of Ise to seek the blessing of his divine ancestor Amaterasu. There he was received by his aunt Yamatohime, the high priestess who served the sun goddess. She gave him the sacred sword Kusanagi and a fire striker, tools that would prove essential in his coming trials, though their true importance would only become apparent when death seemed certain. The journey to the eastern provinces was fraught with dangers both natural and supernatural. Yamato Takaru had to cross treacherous mountain passes where hostile kami dwelt, navigate rivers inhabited by dragon spirits, and penetrate forests where yokai lurked in shadows deeper than night. Each obstacle tested not only his physical courage but his spiritual wisdom, his ability to distinguish between kami who could be appeased and monsters who had to be destroyed. In the province of Suruga, he encountered a local chieftain who pretended friendship but actually planned treachery. The chief invited Yamato Takaru to hunt deer in a great meadow, then set fire to the grass, hoping to burn the prince alive. But the sacred fire striker proved its worth. With it, Yamato Takaru started a counterfire that consumed his enemies while he escaped unharmed. The sword Kusanagi revealed its power as well, cutting down the burning grass around him so swiftly that it earned its name as the grass-cutting sword. The defeat of the treacherous chief and his followers established Yamato Takaru's reputation in the eastern provinces, but it also demonstrated the harsh realities of imperial expansion. The prince was not merely exploring unknown territories but conquering them, imposing the authority of the central government on peoples who had their own traditions and their own relationships with the local kami. This expansion was not always violent, for Yamato Takaru learned to use diplomacy as well as force. He would often approach hostile tribes with offers of marriage alliance, trade agreements, or religious syncretism that allowed local kami to be incorporated into the imperial pantheon. But when negotiation failed, he was prepared to use whatever means necessary to achieve his objectives, and his methods were not always honorable. His greatest victory in the east came against the Emishur chief Takamikazuchi, a warrior of legendary skill who commanded not only human soldiers but also the loyalty of local kami. Their single combat lasted for 3 days and nights, ranging across mountains and valleys. Their battle so fierce that it changed the landscape itself, creating new lakes where their feet had struck the ground and new hills where they had grappled and fallen. In the end, Yamato Takaru's victory came not through superior strength but through superior cunning. He challenged Takamikazuchi to a contest of transformation, each warrior taking the shape of different animals to test their spiritual power. When the Emishur chief became a stag, Yamato Takaru became a wolf and tore out his opponent's throat, winning through treachery what he could not achieve through honest combat. Yet even as he expanded the empire's borders and subdued its enemies, Yamato Takaru felt a growing emptiness in his heart. His victories brought him fame but not satisfaction, power but not peace. He began to understand that his violent nature, while useful for conquest, was not suitable for the kind of wise governance that the empire truly needed. His marriage to Odo Tachibanaheim, a princess of the eastern provinces, offered him a glimpse of what his life might become if he could learn to channel his strength toward protection rather than conquest. She was gentle where he was fierce, wise where he was impetuous, diplomatic where he was direct. Their love was real and deep, perhaps the first genuine affection he had ever experienced. But their happiness was brief. As they sailed across the bay toward the Boso Peninsula, a great storm arose, stirred up by the kami of the sea who were angry at Yamato Takeru's disrespectful treatment of their domain. The waves rose higher than mountains. The wind howled with voices that spoke of ancient grievances, and it became clear that the ship would be destroyed unless the sea gods were appeased. Odo Tachibanaheim understood what was required. Without hesitation, she threw herself into the raging waters as a sacrifice to calm the storm. Her death saved the ship and all aboard it, but it broke something fundamental in Yamato Takeru's spirit. He had lost the one person who had seen goodness in him, who had believed he could become something more than a weapon wielded by others. From that point forward, his campaigns took on a different character. More desperate, more reckless, driven by grief rather than ambition. He conquered the remaining rebel territories in the east, but his victories felt hollow, achievements that meant nothing without someone to share them with. He began to speak of his longing for home, his desire to return to the peaceful provinces of the West where he might find some measure of contentment. His final battle came against the kami of Mount Ibuki, a deity so ancient and powerful that it could take the form of a white boar the size of a bull. Yamato Takeru, weakened by years of constant warfare and poisoned by grief over his wife's death, attacked the mountain god without proper purification or preparation. The boar's breath carried a curse that sapped the prince's strength, leaving him mortally wounded and unable to complete his journey home. As he lay dying on the plain of Nobo, Yamato Takeru sang his death song, a poem that expressed his longing for the peaceful lands of Yamato where he had been born, his regret for the violence that had defined his life, his hope that his deeds had served some purpose greater than his own ambition. When he died, his spirit took the form of a great white bird that flew toward the west, carrying his soul back to the homeland he had served but never truly understood. The death of Yamato Takeru marked the end of the age of heroic conquest and the beginning of a more reflective period in Japanese mythology. The stories that followed would focus less on individual heroes and their mighty deeds and more on the subtle interactions between humans and kami, the development of cultural practices that honored both tradition and innovation, and the emergence of the complex spiritual ecology that would characterize Japanese religion for centuries to come. The prince's transformation into a white bird became a powerful symbol of the possibility that consciousness could transcend the limitations of individual identity, while remaining connected to the places and people that had given life meaning. He had been unable to find peace as a human being, but as a spirit, he achieved the harmony that had eluded him in life. His story became a cautionary tale about the costs of power pursued without wisdom, but also an inspiration for those who sought to redeem themselves through service to others. The violent prince who had killed his brother and conquered his enemies through deception was remembered not for his crimes but for his final transformation. His recognition that true strength lay in protecting rather than destroying, in creating rather than conquering. As the age of heroes gave way to the age of settled civilization, the mythology began to incorporate new kinds of stories, tales not of gods and princes but of ordinary humans who achieved extraordinary things through their dedication to craft, their compassion for others, their deep understanding of the natural world and their place within it. These stories would introduce a vast population of yokai, spirits and monsters that dwelt in the liminal spaces between the human and divine realms, beings that were neither fully good nor entirely evil but simply other, possessed of their own motivations and desires that did not always align with human needs and expectations. The yokai would become some of the most enduring figures in Japanese mythology, for they represented the recognition that the world contained far more than humans could understand or control, that consciousness took forms that defied easy categorization, that wisdom required humility in the face of mystery. They were the shadows cast by the light of the kami, the reminders that even in a world governed by divine order, there remained spaces where chaos could flourish and where the unexpected could emerge at any moment. But that is another story, one that would unfold over centuries as Japanese culture encountered Buddhism from India and Korea, Confucianism from China, and later influences from the wider world. The foundation myths of creation and divine rule had established the framework, but the house of Japanese mythology had many rooms still to be built, many stories still to be told, many truths still to be discovered in the ongoing conversation between human consciousness and the vast mystery that surrounded and sustained it. The age of pure divine rule was ending, but the age of collaboration between gods and mortals was just beginning. The kami had established the cosmic order, but humans would be their partners in maintaining it, their agents in adapting it to changing circumstances, their voices in expressing its meaning for each new generation that inherited the blessed and troubled world that divine love had created from the primordial void. As Japanese civilization matured beyond the heroic age of conquest and divine intervention, the mythology began to acknowledge a more complex reality, one in which the sacred and profane intermingled in countless subtle ways, where spirits both benevolent and mischievous shared the world with humans, and where the boundary between the natural and supernatural was as permeable as morning mist. This was the realm of the yokai, the vast population of spirits, monsters, and magical beings that dwelt in the spaces between the ordered world of human civilization and the pure realm of the kami. Unlike the great gods of the creation myths or the heroic figures of imperial legend, the yokai were intimate and immediate, creatures that might be encountered in the forest behind one's village, in the old well at the edge of town, or even in the dark corners of one's own home. The yokai were not evil in any simple sense, though some could certainly be dangerous. They were instead expressions of the otherness that existed alongside human consciousness. Reminders that the world contained forms of awareness and intention that operated according to different rules, that pursued different goals, that understood reality in ways that humans could barely comprehend. Kitsune, the fox spirits, were perhaps the most famous and complex of the yokai. They began as ordinary foxes, but as they aged and gained wisdom, they developed magical powers and additional tails, up to 9 for the most ancient and powerful. These fox spirits could take human form, often appearing as beautiful women who would seduce men for purposes that ranged from simple mischief to deep spiritual testing. Some kitsune were messengers of Inari, the kami of rice and prosperity, serving as intermediaries between the divine realm and human farmers who depended on good harvests for survival. These fox spirits were benevolent, helping those who showed proper respect to Inari and punishing those who were greedy or wasteful with the gifts of the earth. But other kitsune were wild spirits who answered to no god, pursuing their own complex agendas that might involve love, revenge, curiosity, or simple amusement at the expense of mortals. They might fall genuinely in love with humans and live as faithful wives for decades, only to vanish one day when their true nature was discovered. They might take revenge on families who had disturbed their dens, driving households to madness and ruin through subtle manipulation and supernatural interference. The relationships between humans and kitsune became the subject of countless stories that explored the complexity of trust, love, and identity in a world where nothing was exactly what it seemed. These tales were not merely entertainment but instruction in the art of living wisely in a reality where the supernatural was natural, where magic was commonplace, where the ability to see beyond surface appearances could mean the difference between prosperity and disaster. Tengu, the bird spirits of the mountains, represented a different aspect of the yokai realm. The fierce independence of wild places and the dangerous knowledge that could be gained by those willing to abandon civilized comforts for the sake of spiritual development. Part bird and part human, with great wings and fierce beaks, the Tengu were master warriors whose sword skills surpassed even the greatest human champions. They dwelt in the remote peaks where few humans dared to venture, practicing their martial arts among the clouds, perfecting techniques that incorporated not just physical skill but spiritual power. A warrior who could find and placate a Tengu master might learn sword techniques that would make him invincible in human combat. But the training was harsh and the teachers were unforgiving of weakness or stupidity. The most famous Tengu was Sajobo, who ruled the Tengu of Mount Kurama and who was said to have trained the legendary warrior Minamoto no Yoshitsune in the arts of war. Under Sajobo's tutelage, Yoshitsune learned not just how to wield a sword but how to move like the wind, how to strike like lightning, how to become one with his weapon until the distinction between warrior and blade disappeared entirely. But Tengu knowledge came at a price. Those who learned from the bird spirits often found themselves changed in ways that made it difficult to live comfortably among ordinary humans. They might gain supernatural skills but lose the ability to find satisfaction in simple pleasures. They might see too clearly into the hearts of others, perceiving deceptions and weaknesses that were better left unnoticed. They might become so attuned to spiritual reality that the material world seemed flat and colorless by comparison. Oni, the demon spirits, represented the shadow side of the yokai realm. The expressions of anger, greed, and malice that could emerge when spiritual power was corrupted by negative emotions. These were not fallen angels in the Christian sense, but rather kami or humans who had been transformed by their own darkness into something monstrous and dangerous. The most terrible Oni had once been human beings whose crimes or obsessions had warped their spiritual nature beyond recognition. A warlord whose cruelty exceeded all bounds might become an Oni of war, feeding on bloodshed and delighting in the suffering of the innocent. A merchant whose greed consumed all other considerations might transform into an Oni of avarice, hoarding wealth while bringing poverty and misfortune to others. But the mythology also recognized that Oni could sometimes be redeemed, that even the most corrupted spirit retained some spark of its original nature that could potentially be rekindled through compassion and wisdom. Stories were told of Oni who were converted to Buddhism and became fierce protectors of temples and monasteries, using their supernatural strength to guard sacred spaces and defend the innocent. The most famous of these redemption stories concerned Shutendoji, the great Oni king who ruled from Mount Oi and terrorized the capital with his raids on human settlements. His palace was filled with the bones of his victims. His halls echoed with the screams of the tormented, and his very presence brought disease and madness to all who encountered him. Yet even Shutendoji had once been human, a beautiful young man whose obsession with sake and violence had gradually transformed him into something monstrous. The hero Minamoto no Reiko, aided by supernatural allies and armed with a sword blessed by the kami, finally defeated the Oni king, but not before learning that the monster's transformation had been driven by genuine suffering and legitimate grievances against the injustices of human society. This understanding that even the most terrible yokai had their origins in recognizable human emotions and experiences made them more complex and disturbing than simple embodiments of evil. They were dark mirrors that reflected what humans might become if they allowed their shadow sides to dominate their nature, warnings about the consequences of spiritual imbalance and moral corruption. But the yokai realm also included countless spirits that were neither particularly good nor evil but simply different. Beings with their own needs and desires that sometimes conflicted with human interests but were not motivated by malice. The tanuki, raccoon dogs with the power of transformation and illusion, might trick travelers into losing their way for no better reason than amusement. The kappa, water spirits with the strength of demons but the minds of children, might drown swimmers who disturbed their ponds or help farmers irrigate their fields, depending on how they were approached. These yokai taught humans important lessons about living in a world where consciousness took many forms, where intelligence and power were not limited to human beings, where wisdom required the ability to negotiate with non-human entities that had their own rights and territories. The farmer who left offerings for the kami of his fields was also wise to acknowledge the yokai who shared those spaces, ensuring that his work proceeded in harmony with all the spiritual forces that influenced the fertility of the soil. The development of yokai lore reflected the growing sophistication of Japanese spiritual thought as it encountered and absorbed influences from Buddhism and other foreign traditions. The simple animism of the earliest periods, which had seen kami in every natural phenomenon, evolved into a more complex understanding of the spiritual ecology that surrounded human existence. Buddhism brought with it concepts of karma and reincarnation that explained how beings could be transformed from one life to another, how actions in one existence could influence the form taken in subsequent incarnations. This provided a framework for understanding how humans might become yokai and how yokai might eventually achieve enlightenment and escape the cycle of transformation entirely. The Buddhist emphasis on compassion for all sentient beings also influenced attitudes toward yokai, encouraging the development of practices designed to appease or convert potentially dangerous spirits rather than simply destroying them. Temples became places of refuge not only for humans seeking spiritual guidance, but also for yokai seeking to escape their own trapped or corrupted nature. As the centuries passed, the yokai became increasingly integrated into Japanese culture, appearing in art, literature, theater, and popular festivals. They were no longer fearsome mysteries dwelling in remote wilderness but familiar neighbors whose moods and habits were as well known as those of human community members. This familiarity bred not contempt but a complex relationship of mutual respect and occasional conflict. Humans learned to read the signs that indicated yokai presence, to recognize which spirits could be safely approached and which were best avoided, to understand the protocols that governed interaction between the different forms of consciousness that shared the Japanese islands. The seasonal festivals that punctuated the Japanese year became occasions for acknowledging and honoring these non-human neighbors. During Obon, the festival of the dead, yokai as well as human spirits were welcomed back to visit the world of the living. During the various harvest festivals, offerings were made not only to the agricultural kami, but also to the field spirits and household yokai, whose cooperation was essential for prosperity. This integration of the yokai into the spiritual and social life of Japan represented one of the most distinctive achievements of Japanese religious culture. The creation of a comprehensive worldview that could accommodate multiple forms of consciousness without requiring them to be hierarchically arranged or reduced to simple categories of good and evil. The yokai were neither worshipped like kami nor feared like demons, but simply acknowledged as part of the complex ecosystem of awareness that surrounded human existence. They were the spirits of places and processes, of emotions and experiences, of the countless small mysteries that filled daily life with wonder and occasionally with terror. In the modern world, the yokai continue to capture the imagination, appearing in anime and manga, video games and horror films, serving as metaphors for the psychological and spiritual challenges that face contemporary humans living in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. They remind us that consciousness is not limited to human forms, that intelligence and intention permeate the world in ways we are only beginning to understand, that wisdom requires humility in the face of mysteries that may never be fully solved. The great gift of the yokai tradition is its recognition that the world is far stranger and more wonderful than rational analysis alone can reveal, that there are forms of knowledge that can only be gained through direct encounter with otherness, that the boundary between self and world is far more permeable than modern consciousness usually acknowledges. In preserving and honoring the stories of yokai, Japanese culture maintained a connection to modes of awareness that other civilizations often lost in their pursuit of purely rational understanding. The yokai served as guardians of the irrational, the intuitive, the mysterious aspects of existence that give life its depth and meaning, its capacity to surprise and transform those who remain open to encounters with the impossible. As Buddhism took deeper root in Japanese soil, it began to interact with the indigenous mythology in ways that would transform both traditions. The Buddha's teaching about the interconnectedness of all existence resonated powerfully with the Japanese understanding of kami dwelling in all things, but it also introduced new concepts that would complicate and enrich the spiritual landscape. The Buddhist emphasis on suffering as an inescapable aspect of existence aligned with the tragic elements already present in Japanese mythology. The death of Izanami, the grief of Amaterasu, the doomed heroism of figures like Yamato Takeru. But Buddhism also offered the promise that suffering could be transcended through proper understanding and practice, that the cycle of death and rebirth could be escaped through the achievement of enlightenment. This created a tension between the Japanese appreciation for the beauty of transient things and the Buddhist goal of transcending attachment to the phenomenal world. The resolution of this tension would produce some of the most distinctive features of Japanese culture. The aesthetic principles that found perfection in impermanence, the spiritual practices that sought enlightenment through engagement with rather than escape from the material world. The kami themselves were gradually incorporated into the Buddhist cosmology as manifestations of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, divine beings who had chosen to appear in forms comprehensible to Japanese consciousness rather than in their true transcendent nature. This allowed traditional practices to continue while being understood in new ways, local customs to be preserved while being connected to universal spiritual principles. Temples were built beside Shinto shrines, and priests of both traditions learned to work together in serving the spiritual needs of communities that saw no contradiction in honoring both the kami of their ancestors and the Buddha whose teaching promised liberation from all suffering. The two traditions complemented each other, Shinto providing connection to place and ancestry, Buddhism offering hope for ultimate transcendence. But the interaction was not always harmonious. There were periods of conflict between Buddhist monks and Shinto priests, competition for imperial patronage and popular support, theological disputes about the relationship between kami and Buddhas. These conflicts reflected deeper tensions about the direction Japanese culture should take as it continued to encounter and absorb influences from the wider world. The resolution, when it came, was characteristically Japanese, not a victory of one tradition over another, but a creative synthesis that preserved what was valuable in each while creating something new that could not have emerged from either tradition alone. This synthesis would be tested and refined over many centuries, adapting to new challenges and influences while maintaining its essential character. The medieval period saw the emergence of new forms of mythology that reflected the increasing complexity of Japanese society and its engagement with international culture. Warriors developed their own spiritual traditions that combined Buddhist meditation with Shinto reverence for ancestral spirits and the kami of war. Artisans created new forms of beauty that expressed Buddhist insights through traditional Japanese aesthetic principles. Poets and writers began to explore the psychological and spiritual dimensions of the mythological tradition, creating works that treated the ancient stories not as literal history, but as profound explorations of human consciousness and its relationship to the larger patterns that governed existence. The Tale of Genji, the world's first novel, was suffused with Buddhist understanding of impermanence while celebrating the Shinto appreciation for natural beauty and seasonal change. This literary tradition would preserve and transmit the essential insights of Japanese mythology even as the political and social structures that had originally supported them underwent radical transformation. The stories lived on in new forms, speaking to new generations about eternal truths that remained relevant despite changing circumstances. The mythology's emphasis on harmony between human consciousness and natural rhythms would prove especially important as Japan faced the challenges of modernization and international engagement. The traditional understanding that humans were not separate from nature but part of it provided resources for addressing environmental problems and social disruption that purely rational approaches could not match. The yokai tradition, in particular, would prove remarkably adaptable to modern circumstances, with new spirits emerging to embody contemporary anxieties and opportunities. Urban yokai began to appear in the folklore, spirits of subways and skyscrapers, supernatural beings that fed on electromagnetic radiation or that manifested in computer networks and digital communications. This adaptability reflected the fundamental insight that consciousness was not limited to biological forms, that awareness could emerge wherever complexity and information reached sufficient density, that the spiritual dimension of existence was not separate from technological development but intimately connected to it. As Japan became a global cultural force in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, its mythology began to influence international consciousness through anime, manga, video games, and other forms of popular culture. The stories of kami and yokai, heroes and monsters, found new audiences around the world, speaking to universal human needs while maintaining their distinctively Japanese character. The global appeal of Japanese mythology lay partly in its sophisticated understanding of the relationship between tradition and innovation, continuity and change. The ancient stories remained alive and relevant because they had always been about adaptation and transformation, about finding ways to honor the past while embracing the future, about maintaining spiritual depth while engaging with material progress. But perhaps more importantly, Japanese mythology offered a vision of existence that was both realistic about suffering and conflict and hopeful about the possibility of harmony and beauty. It acknowledged that life was difficult, that consciousness was fragile, that the forces of destruction were always present and powerful. But it also insisted that these dark realities made moments of peace and beauty more precious, not less, that the struggle to maintain harmony was what gave life its meaning and purpose. In the end, Japanese mythology provided what all great spiritual traditions provide. Not easy answers to life's difficult questions, but better ways of thinking about those questions. Richer frameworks for understanding the human condition. Deeper appreciation for the mystery and wonder of existence itself. The kami and yokai, the heroes and ordinary people, the sacred and profane aspects of reality, all were part of a great tapestry that revealed the complexity and beauty of consciousness in all its myriad forms. The stories continue to be told, continue to evolve, continue to find new expressions in each generation's encounter with the eternal questions about what it means to be aware in a universe that encompasses both creation and destruction, both meaning and mystery, both the intimately familiar and the utterly other. They are living mythology, growing and changing while maintaining their essential truth, speaking across centuries and cultures to anyone willing to listen with an open heart and mind. As the classical age of Japanese mythology drew to a close, its influence spread far beyond the islands where it had been born, carried by traders and diplomats, scholars and artists to every corner of the known world. But its greatest legacy was not in the exotic tales it told, but in the fundamental understanding it embodied, that consciousness was sacred wherever it appeared, that beauty was worth preserving even when it could not last forever, that harmony was possible between seemingly incompatible forces if wisdom and compassion guided the effort to achieve it. The kami continued to dwell in their sacred places, tended by priests and honored by ordinary people who understood that the divine was not distant but intimate, not separate from daily life but woven into its very fabric. The yokai continued to manifest in new forms appropriate to changing times, reminding each generation that the world contained more than human reason could encompass, that mystery and wonder were not problems to be solved but dimensions of existence to be celebrated. And in the stories themselves, in their endless capacity to surprise and delight, to comfort and challenge, to connect the immediate concerns of individual lives with the vast patterns that govern the cosmos, the true immortality of Japanese mythology was found. These were not just tales from a distant past, but living truths that continued to illuminate the path forward for anyone seeking to understand what it meant to be human in a universe where gods and spirits, beauty and terror, love and loss danced together in patterns too complex for any single mind to fully comprehend. The sun still rose each morning as Amaterasu had promised. The seasons still turned as the kami had ordained, and in the space between heartbeats, between one breath and the next, the sacred continued to manifest in forms both ancient and eternally new. The mythology lived on, not as dogma to be believed but as wisdom to be lived, not as history to be memorized but as possibility to be explored, not as answers to be accepted but as questions to be pondered by each soul brave enough to seek its own understanding of the great mystery that surrounds and sustains all existence. The stories end, but they never truly end, for they live now in those who have heard them, in the choices they will make, in the beauty they will create, in the harmony they will seek between their own small lives and the vast, wonderful, terrible, and magnificent cosmos of which they are part. Good night.